Secretary Esper, welcome to the program.
Good evening, Christiane.
Can I start, because everybody wants to know this, and apparently Congress will be briefed today and tomorrow. The administration has talked about an imminent threat, and that is what led to this strike. As you know, many well-plugged-in officials, people who apparently have had access to the intelligence briefings even after the strike, have reported to our colleagues that the evidence may be razor thin and that chatter was nothing out of the ordinary for what you already know about Soleimani and his plans and activities. So I guess, can you look the American people and the world down the barrel of this camera straight in the eye and say that there was a ticking time bomb evidence?
Well, thank you, Christiane. First of all, let me send a few messages to the American people and the broader world. First of all, to the American people, I want to assure them that they have the best military in the world. And the young men and women who wear our uniform of any service are extremely capable and professional and prepared to defend our homeland, our people, and our interests in the region and more broadly. Secondly, I'd like to say to our service members and our diplomats in the region that we have your back. We thoroughly support what you're doing. We're proud of you, and that we are taking every necessary step to ensure force protection, as I know you ready yourself for what may be ahead. Mm-hmm. Thirdly, to our partners and allies, and directly to the Iranian regime, I'd like to say we are not looking to start a war with Iran, but we are prepared to finish one. As I've told my many colleagues, as I've spoke to them over the last few days, what we'd like to see is this situation de-escalated and for Tehran to sit down with us and begin a discussion about a better way ahead. We think that's the best approach at this point in time. Now, Christiane, with regard to your question about the intelligence, I can assure you that it's more than razor thin, and it's persuasive. The fact of the matter is, Soleimani was caught red-handed on the ground in Baghdad. One terrorist leader of a terrorist organization meeting with another terrorist leader to synchronize and plan additional attacks on American forces, diplomats, or facilities. I think we took the right action to remove these players from the battlefield.
So, ticking time bomb, imminent threat, is that what you're saying?
I think the threat was being orchestrated by Soleimani. That's what the intelligence reported. That's what he was doing on the ground in both Baghdad, in Damascus, and elsewhere. And I think it was only a matter of days, certainly no more than weeks.
So that's days, weeks, rather than the immediate. Let me ask you this.
Well,
presumably we'll hear more from Congress. And I guess I want to ask you what you're picking up now, because you've seen the scenes inside Iran. You can see that that's not just an outpouring of grief from the people there and rallying around a regime that had been unpopular, but that it's also a message. I mean, that is a message, and you know that better than anybody. You commanded troops on the ground in the first Gulf War, and you have to know your enemy. What do you think they're going to do, and what will the United States tolerate?
Yeah, well, let me answer that in a moment here, but let me go back 1 second. You know, much of this discussion about the strike we made on Soleimani has to look at context, too. Here's a person for over 20 years has conducted terrorist acts around the world, specifically in that region. He has the blood of hundreds of American soldiers and service members in his hands and the wounding of thousands more. In the last 12 months alone, he directed, approved, or resourced attacks on United States forces, culminating in the late December strike that resulted in the death of an American. And then, of course, he was responsible for the siege of the American embassy in Baghdad. So this is no innocent man. This is a terrorist leader of a terrorist organization, and his time was due. Now, with regard to the Iranian people, the question you asked, what you see is what you see. I will tell you that the Iranian people, many, are upset with the regime that for 40 years now has tried to export its revolutionary zeal, and instead of focusing its time and attention and resources on enabling the Iranian people and giving them the liberties and freedoms that they want, has rather suppressed them. And in some cases, in this case led by the IRGC Quds Force and Soleimani, oppressed or killed Iranian citizens. So we'll see what happens next. We're prepared for the worst. We hope that cooler heads in Tehran will wisen up and decide to de-escalate this situation.
Okay, so you're sending a very strong message of de-escalation. Obviously, you say the United States doesn't want this to launch into war. I asked you what would be tolerable to the United States for a response from Iran. But I also want to read this to you because it's news just in, and that is, even though you've answered the so-called confusion about this leaked letter suggesting a withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq, that is not the message that the Iraqi Prime Minister is giving to his people tonight. He has said publicly tonight, I received a letter from the U.S. leadership speaking about the withdrawal. After 4 or 5 hours, it was said to be a mistake. The message was clearly indicating a withdrawal from Iraq. We directly send the letter to the Foreign Ministry, to our ambassador in Washington, and to other parties. And as you know, he's been quoted as saying we interpret that as calling for a withdrawal. Wouldn't that precisely be what the Iranians have wanted? And could an unintended consequence of this strike actually end with U.S. forces somehow withdrawing from Iraq and from the region?
Well, first of all, Christiane, a draft unsigned letter that was acquired by an Iraqi official has no import. It has no value whatsoever. So the fact that anybody would take it seriously or respond to it, I would say this: the United States is not withdrawing from Iraq. In fact, in my conversations with my counterpart, the Iraqi defense minister, I conveyed to him that we do want to stay in Iraq. We want to continue the important defeat ISIS mission, that we're there partnering with them by helping train and assist them, which also has the salutary benefit of also helping enable a more strong, a more independent, a more prosperous Iraq. That's what the Iraqi people want. In fact, in the last few days, Iraqis are still protesting their government's corruption in other parts of the country. That's not being focused on. Also, in my conversations with allies and partners, both in the region and outside the region in Europe, I've assured them that the United States is committed to the defeat ISIS mission. And to do that, we need to retain a presence in Iraq to be there to enable the Iraqi government and to enable that mission.
Okay, so 2 points there. One, obviously, Secretary Pompeo has said that everybody will be much safer since this attack, and yet the Americans are being told to withdraw from Iraq and other such places. The American, people from the embassy, but also you talk about continuing the fight against ISIS, and surely that's an immediate casualty. I mean, you've announced publicly that that will be limited or suspended. Most military people, commanders who I've spoken to, say that your forces are going to be hunkered down in Syria and Iraq. You won't be fighting ISIS. You will be fully in force protection mode. Surely that's a victory for the terrorists there.
Well, we continue to gauge ISIS in Syria and elsewhere. Of course, ISIS is a threat that is operating all the way from Africa across the Middle East into Afghanistan. With regard to Iraq, our mission there is to train, advise, and assist the Iraqis. So I don't see any material impact right now in the short term on that mission. Again, the broader message is that we are there to help the Iraqi people. I think it's evident in the vote that was held the other day. If you look at it, nearly all the Kurds and all the new Sunni Council representative members either abstained or did not vote because they recognize the strategic importance of the relationship between the United States and Iraq. And those Shia who did vote, in many cases, did so because they were threatened by these Iranian-sponsored Shia militia groups who said either vote our way or else. And so I think, again, when you look at the broader message, the broader needs and wants of the Iraqi people, what they want is what we want: a strong, independent, and prosperous Iraq that is free from malign Iranian influence.
I want to ask you about the 52 sites that President Trump tweeted about once and then doubled down on, and you have responded by saying the United States military will abide by the Code of Uniformed and Armed Conflict. As you know, it is illegal, it is a war crime just to give such an order. Again, you were a commander on the ground, and you know that a general or a commander cannot even give such an order because that would be a war crime, even if it's not carried out. You would have to, as the senior civilian in the Defense Department, you would have to refuse that order and make sure it wasn't given. Are you prepared to do that?
Look, as we always have, the United States will follow the laws of armed conflict and international law, and I have no doubt in my mind at the end of the day that we will follow the laws of armed conflict if we end up in a situation with Iran, and that the commander-in-chief will only give us legal orders.
So the cultural targets, the cultural sites are off the table, is that correct?
We do not violate the laws of armed conflict.
Can I ask you, what you make of even your allies, even those who are, let's say, anti-Iranian, like the Saudis, like the others, like the Israelis, many allies in the region, have told you publicly, privately, and the Saudi Deputy Defense Minister has been meeting with you, meeting with other high officials to call for restraint. Your other allies, the British, the Germans, the French, NATO allies, are calling on you and Iran to de-escalate. You are being put in the same boat as Iran. I don't recall this ever happening before, where the United States and a nation like Iran are both being put in the same boat and both being asked to de-escalate. How does that make you feel?
Well, I guess I disagree with your premise, Christiane. I will tell you, and I've talked to all these allies and partners, the ones in the region are fully 100% supportive of what we've done and what we're prepared to do. They see the removal of Soleimani, this known terrorist and head of a terrorist organization, his removal from the battlefield is a great victory. And they know what it means, that it's a game changer for the region. So they are fully behind us. They are saying, beyond that, much like we are, is it's time for this situation to be de-escalated. The Iranian government, the Iranian regime, has been escalating now for 40 years. It's peaked in the last several months. I was very clear in my public messaging to the media and elsewhere that these attacks need to stop, the escalation in scale and scope, many of which, if not all of which, were orchestrated or directed or approved by Soleimani. I did the same messaging as well when I met with my counterparts in Iraq and elsewhere. So this has been, the escalation has been driven by Iran, not by the United States. We have now responded in self-defense, and now we're saying at this point in time is it's time to de-escalate the situation. Let's get back on a different path, a path where we sit down across the negotiating table and find a better way forward in terms of how Iran can start behaving like a normal country.
With respect, Mr. Secretary, senior Americans have told me that intelligence officials, your own intelligence officials, predicted precisely this kind of Iranian escalation after the maximum pressure campaign that followed the withdrawal from the nuclear deal. They predicted attacks on shipping in the Gulf. It happened. They predicted attacks on Saudi Arabia. It happened. They suggested it might happen against U.S. bases, U.S. targets. It did happen. You talk about Soleimani, but what is the strategy here? I mean, you knew that this was possibly going to happen. Was it wise? You talk about Soleimani. Nobody is claiming that he was a good guy. No, none of your allies are. And everybody knows what his role in the region was. But by the same token, previous U.S. administrations, when they could, did not take him out. Israel, when it could, did not take him out for fear of the consequences. I guess I want to ask you, do you regret putting that extreme option on the table for the president? Wouldn't some of the other options have sufficed in this period to send a very strong message of deterrence?
Well, Christiane, I would say many experts going back a few years now predicted and were proven true that in the wake of the JICPOA, which did not cover ballistic missiles, which did not cover Iran's hostage-taking, which did not cover Iran's malign behavior, that such activities would pick up, particularly when we opened up the economic spigots and we returned to them tens of billions of dollars. We saw this activity tick up across the region, again, spanning from Africa through the Middle East to Afghanistan. And what's happened in the last few years in Iraq in particular, in the last 12 months, is just a manifestation of a Iranian regime that is bent on exporting its revolutionary beliefs. And so that was predicted. What we felt as an act of self-defense in response to this was enough is enough. They did not heed our warnings. It was time America responded. And it was the first time we've done so forcefully, and as long as I can remember. So the message has been delivered. I think at this point, it's time for the Iranians to step back and realize that the game has changed, and we're not going to put up with this bad behavior.
So you stand by that advice, that sort of the ultra option, so to speak?
Well, I don't characterize anything. My obligation and duty is to present to the president a series of military options that achieve an end state, a political end state. And when we do that, we present him with the pros and cons, the pluses and the minuses, and we go in there fully aware of what it may mean. And again, in this case, given the facts on the ground, seeing the escalatory behavior of the Iranians, their unwillingness to heed our warnings, that it was time that we took an action that would take a terrorist leader of a terrorist organization off the battlefield. He is the orchestrator of all that has been malign behavior throughout the region for 2+ decades now.
Secretary Esper, I know you have to go. Thank you for joining us from the Pentagon.